to Hi everyone. I would like to welcome you and thank you for attending this session, which is going to be the first session in the 2020/2021 Alireza Ahmadiyyan lectures this year. We are basically aiming to start at 4:05, and again, we thank you for your attending and for your patience, and we'll see you soon. Thank you. Hello again, it's a pleasure to be back. My name is Mustafa Abedini, and I'm an assistant professor without review of Persian literary culture and civilization at the University of British Columbia. Before anything, I would like to acknowledge that UBC Vancouver campus is located on the traditional, unceded, and ancestral territory of the Musqueam people. This lecture, as I mentioned, is the first in the winter 2020 series of the Alireza Ahmadiyyan lectures in Iranian and Persianate studies. These lectures were renamed in 2019 in honor of Alireza, a beloved former student and member of the Canadian Iranian community. And thanks to his family and friends, the funding for this series has currently been secured until the end of 2025/2026 academic year. As many of you know, Alireza Ahmadiyyan was a proud graduate of UBC. He achieved his BA in 2011, and he was a passionate supporter of the initiative to establish a Persian language and Iranian studies program at the university before he tragically passed away in 2019. The Faculty of Arts is delighted to announce that Alireza's family and friends have provided funding to support the annual Iranian and Persianate Studies lecture series in Alireza's memory. This generous gift will fund the lecture, as I mentioned, the lecture series through to the end of 2025/2026 academic year. We are proud to continue the naming of this lecture series in memory of the Ahmadiyyan family's beloved Alireza. On behalf of the Faculty of Arts, I would like to say thank you to the Ahmadiyyan family and their community for this generous support. We are excited about the community engagement and academic resources that the Alireza Ahmadiyyan lectures in Iranian and Persianate studies will bring for this year and many years to come. I really cannot wait to introduce our presenter this afternoon. However, before I do that shortly, there's a couple of points I would like to mention. First of all, I would like to thank a lot my team, without whose great efforts this endeavor would have really been impossible. I would like to thank Sophie Gardner, Connie Wu, and Ann Liu of the Asian Studies Department, who have been tremendously helping us with the technical support. And I would also like to thank two volunteers, Mr. Razman Gudarzi and Mr. Darius Darcy, both of whom have been either previous or our current student at UBC. Razman has been helping us with voluntarily designing all the posters for the series, and Darius is helping us for making these lectures more inclusive by providing closed captions. Please also note that we are recording the session to post on YouTube afterwards for those who couldn't attend, so they can watch it later. Also, I would like to ask that if anyone has a question for the presenter, please type it in the Q&A box at the bottom, so our presenter will have some question time for those at the end of her presentation. And now to introduce our presenter. Dr. Amy Tahani-Bidmeshki is instructor in the English division at Pasadena City College, California, where she teaches with an emphasis on the study of race, sexuality, class, and gender within the larger context of the American history and culture. Her teaching and research interests include Afro-pessimism, critical theory, anti-colonialism, internationalism, psychoanalysis, nationalism, and literatures of revolutionary movements and resistance literature. In addition to working on the far reach of Black radicalism in Southwest Asia and North Africa, she looks at Black masculinity in the long history of Black fatherhood in the United States. I would like to ask all of you to welcome basically our presenter, Dr. Amy Tahani-Bidmeshki. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mustafa John. I'm being heard, yes?
Yes, you are.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Mustafa John. I'm always honored by your invitations to share in thought partnership because I admire you on so many levels. I really appreciate this opportunity as well as your brilliant team, including Sophie Gardner, Darius Darcy, Razman Gudarzi, Connie Wu, and An Liu. I also want to highlight the continuous protests in honor of all the Black people murdered at the hands of law enforcement, including 26-year-old Breonna Taylor, in which the grand jury of Louisville, Kentucky deemed as a quote-unquote wanton endangerment on the part of the cop who killed her in her sleep. As W.E.B. Du Bois reminds us, quote, "A system cannot fail those it was never meant to protect." I honor their lives and I recommit to doing everything I can to support Black freedom fighters. So I'd like to begin this presentation as well with a land acknowledgement and a pledge to honor the indigenous peoples of the world in my thought, scholarship, and actions. I acknowledge that I am a guest on the land my immigrant Iranian family and I inhabit today. This land, once known as Tovangar, was the home of the Tongva people, the stewards of this land who continue to live in the Los Angeles area and care for this land. They are among thousands of indigenous people living in Los Angeles from across the United States, as Los Angeles is home to the largest population of indigenous peoples in this settler colonial nation state. For many people, what happened to the Gabrielino, Tongva, and other indigenous peoples in the world is a distorted history that seeks to erase the unethical and unjust actions of Europeans who colonized indigenous lands, including those of Black Africans, who were permanently ripped away from their ancestral continent. I hope that beginning with this statement, we share a better understanding of our world. But more importantly, I hope we process together how we are complicit in upholding systems of power that continue to harm Black and indigenous peoples since 1492. I share this quote from Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth to emphasize the profound loss to indigenous peoples in this post-1492 world. He says, For a colonized people, the most essential value, because the most concrete, is first and foremost the land which will bring them bread, and above all, dignity. Due to the constraints of time in this presentation, I will jump into the grotesque practices of enslavement of Black Africans by Iranians since as early as the 7th century, with a peak during the 1800s until its abolition in 1929. That's right, the 20th century. Notably, various Iranian dynasties practiced enslavement, but I am focusing on racialized enslavement and anti-Blackness, especially as 1800s Iranians gravitated towards European values. I want to understand how European and West Asian peoples who become so-called white are replaced by Black Africans in Iran as enslaved people. Certainly, just as 19th century Iranians imitated European dress codes, sexual practices, ideals of governance, and technological advances, they adopted whiteness as an ideology of superiority, which automatically means upholding anti-Blackness. Currently, and more specifically since the 1990s, scholars of Iranian history, literature, and culture have made important contributions to the work of exposing enslavement practices by Iranians. But what is truly disturbing is that most people of Iranian descent do not know the wretched history of the enslavement of Black Africans in Iran, and those who might often resort to absurd declarations of so-called benevolent slavery and emphasize that Iranians enslaved Black Africans but treated the enslaved as so-called family. Now, I don't know about you, but how many of you treat your family as unpaid and compulsory servants, castrated bodyguards, unpaid houseworkers and caretakers, and non-consenting sexual partners? But that is what these Iranian apologists are saying when they erase the brutality of anti-Blackness with a dismissive comment about benevolent slavery. I encourage you to look into the critical interventions of scholars such as Parisa Vaziri, Shadi Malaklu, Pedram Khosronejad, and Bita Baghi-Luzidadeh. I butchered that, sorry Bita, whose sharp analyses and research into Iranian culture, and especially apologist anti-Black sentiment, is generative and necessary. And if you would look at this slide for a moment, I've put a definition of anti-Blackness here. It's very important for you to understand that it's a specific type of racism. For a lot of us in race studies, we separate racism from anti-Blackness, specifically for this reason. And I also want to point out in these images, you see some of the Black enslaved peoples. The map is a very important one as well, because we're mostly used to seeing the western coast of Africa and the different enslavement routes, right? The different parts of the world that the enslavers were taking Black Africans. So this side of Africa with the Indian Ocean is also important for us to think about. Okay, those of you who are of Iranian descent or who are engaged in Iranian studies at any level knew I was going to go there, right? So if someone believes that these narratives about Iranianness as Aryanness aren't quite simply the epitome of anti-Black Iranian sentiment, then I really hope that person is paying attention. With the advent of racial classifications by European philosophers, writers, I'm sorry, I've lost one of my pages, but the writers, the philosophers, the pseudoscientists, the historians, we know that they want to paint whiteness as an Aryanness, right? There's so much scholarship on this subject, but the reason I am most concerned with Iranian allegiance to notions of Aryan heritage is because it requires anti-Blackness, including a ridiculous belief that all Iranians are fair-skinned. And there were only benevolent enslavers, as I mentioned. Aside from the fact that this Aryanness is a mythological fantasy steeped in white supremacy worldviews of the European Enlightenment, Iranians fail to acknowledge what Neda Makbule righteously coins as the limits of whiteness. Of course, the category of white is a mutable racial marker. People with Irish, Italian, Polish, and other European heritages were not always so-called white. But the more whiteness feels threatened, the more the boundaries are loosened. So much so that today, on bureaucratic forms, Iranians, like other Southwest Asians, only have the choice to mark ourselves as white, despite the fact that we know whiteness oppresses us. For Iranians, the hostage crisis, all the way through the Muslim ban, our lived experiences don't quite align with our racial affiliation. So how is it that Iranians can simultaneously be identified as white and non-Black people of color? Afro-pessimism and its corollary known as chronopolitics of man are important and useful frameworks for understanding how racism and anti-Blackness developed and continue to wreak havoc in our world today. I am sharing a very superficial theoretical framework of Afro-pessimism, again, due to time constraints, which grounds our lived experiences as racialized peoples in the Ma'afa. This is a key Swahili word that means great disaster beyond human comprehension, or also known as a transatlantic slave trade, as well as the idea of the need for continuous and gratuitous Black social death. We learned through Afro-pessimism that we are all complicit in harm to Black peoples. I have adapted this chart from the inimitable Dr. Shadi Maleklu, whose work delves deep into the post-1492 world structure. As you see in this graph, racism divides people into categories based on the epidermis and phenotypes. The human, first and foremost, is white. We have semi-humans who are non-Black people of color, also often referred to as brown, and non-human, which is the Black person. European Enlightenment thinkers placed white at the top of this hierarchy. They extended qualities such as beauty, intelligence, nobility, bravery, and industriousness to this category of peoples. The ideal human is a cis male, straight, upper class, able, Christian person whose rights and dignity are always guaranteed by the systems, institutions, and structures of this current world. This position requires another group of peoples to be non-human or Black. The racist deemed Black peoples as barbaric, savage, base, not beautiful, not intelligent, not hardworking. Of course, none of these stereotypes, biases, and prejudices are true, but the racists set up the systems to reinforce philosophy, ideology, and culture such that Black people are not able to achieve the same comforts and positions as white people. In fact, you will want to note that Hegel, the academic star of European Enlightenment philosophy, says, quote, Africa has no history. And that shows in this graph where Black is at the nexus of time and space. Everyone else progresses through history, but Black people are locked in time and deemed unnotable. Then we have this large category of non-white, non-Black peoples who are in close proximity to human, but are still not as worthy as white peoples. An example of this is the erasure of Black migrants and immigrants at the US-Mexico border, with the simultaneous erasure of the idea of family separation as an old practice in the United States, which was committed against Black peoples through enslavement and now through mass incarceration. And further, the heightened attention on Latinx communities as those facing the brunt of white supremacy and militarism through organizations such as ICE removes Black communities as oppressed peoples from this kind of harm. That is why the line is dashed. Semi-humans can traverse the boundary through class, religion, sexuality, gender, ability, but not race. Also, semi-humans gain more access to being human by committing to anti-Blackness. The more they move towards becoming human, the more they move away from Blackness. Sometimes we refer to non-Black people of color as being quote unquote white adjacent, for the fact that many of us assimilate into whiteness very well. As Dr. Maleklu righteously declares, Black lives don't matter until our non-Black lives do. So a complete destruction of this world structure, as diagrammed here, is well overdue. So if you would take a moment, please, and look at these slides and these images. I should say too, and I want to make myself as clear as possible, I am not undermining, diminishing, nor ignoring the oppressions that non-Black people of color face at the hands of whiteness. That is absolutely not the focus of this presentation, but I am always dismayed to see non-Black people of color uphold anti-Blackness by appropriating Blackness, either for leisure, capital gains, or as a way to wield resistance to the status quo. Even worse, many non-Black POC dismiss the ongoing atrocities committed against Black communities through their assimilation into whiteness and a sharp focus on their own oppression, void of its intersections with anti-Blackness. Here are a few examples in the Iranian context: Bandari music and Haji Firuz, both of which are popular forms of Iranian culture, but stripped of the history and people who produce it or are represented by it. Even more recently, as you see in the center top and the right top, the Islamic Republic and its citizenry problematically use images and slogans from the movement for Black lives and the murder of George Floyd to highlight injustice towards Black people, and again, erased and denied anti-Blackness in the nation state and its history. This use of Black culture without attribution, sometimes for profit, and always without accountability, happens in the Iranian diaspora communities as well. Until the Iranians understand that all oppression is practiced upon and sharpened upon Black communities and consequently refuse to participate and uphold these harmful anti-Black beliefs, values, and practices, we are complicit in violence. I remember when the Muslim ban affected Iranians in Los Angeles and everyone was worried, scared, and felt helpless. But if Iranians pay attention to the history of the settler colonial nation state, they will see that they are not the only affected ones and haven't been throughout history, and most importantly, owe a great deal to Black and Indigenous resistance, which aims to liberate us all from whiteness. So if Iranians turn out for rallies and marches that deem their existence as second class to their European counterparts, I expect to see the same people at Black Lives Matter marches and rallies. It is time to divest from whiteness. So I think it's important to end on a note of action and accountability. As you see in this slide, I list common sentiments from non-Black peoples, including Iranians, when we discuss issues of anti-Blackness. I've listed some, not all, actions we can take to make effective changes as part of the movement for Black lives, which is ultimately tied to our own liberation from whiteness. Something I always do when I'm invited to speak at institutions or events with institutional wealth is to donate any honoraria I receive to Black grassroots organizations in the area I live. My suggestion to fellow non-Black academics is to remember that most settler colonial nation states, including the United States, Canada, all of Europe, have yet to reckon with the brutal legacy of the Ma'afa. The very least we can do is a local level form of reparations. Let us look at some of the common sentiments of non-Black people and discussions about their complicity in anti-Blackness. Oftentimes, and some of you may be having these moments right now, I'll hear something like, "This is horrible, I'm so upset and angry." My response, good. That's a good sign that your humanity is somewhat still intact. You can see when something is egregious and unjust. But as Audre Lorde says, anger is useful, hatred is not. If you are just becoming aware, you need to educate yourself a lot before joining frontline movement work. Another common thing I'll hear, okay, but my family weren't enslavers. Okay, it's important to learn more about your cultural and familial histories. And even if you know for a fact that your family never enslaved Black Africans, privilege moves beyond economic class. pardon me, white privilege, for example, is racial privilege. And so you can be poor and still have racial advantages. Another common one, I know it's terrible, but what can I do? Educate yourself by listening to Black freedom fighters. The struggle for Black liberation is a 400+ year movement. Read, watch films, and offer your skills where you are asked to. Another one, but like you said, everyone is oppressed by whiteness. Why are you only focusing on Black people? The post-1492 world in which race is a system of power emerges and sharpens its oppression on Black communities first. There is no oppression faced by non-Black people that hasn't happened or isn't happening in Black communities. If we all join the abolition of whiteness and anti-Blackness, we end all forms of oppression. Come on, not all Black people are suffering. Look at Oprah. Or insert any celebrity, Black person celebrity. Anti-Blackness exceeds economic class, right? This is something really important. Remember, it's an ideology. So even Oprah experiences anti-Blackness, as she did in that infamous situation in a Swiss department store in 2013, where she was going to purchase a purse or piece of jewelry that was thousands of dollars, and the salesperson wouldn't sell it to her and claimed that they didn't recognize who she is and were falling back upon all the stereotypes about Black people. And of course, Black people are racist too. Racism, I think this is important. A lot of people don't necessarily have this definition nailed down. Racism is the combination of a group of people claiming race superiority over other groups of people with the institutional, structural, and systemic ability to enforce that superiority. So Black and other people of color cannot be racist in the United States. There's no such thing as reverse racism towards white people. People of color and Black people can be biased, prejudiced, discriminatory, and have preconceptions about others, but that doesn't have any backing by an institution or a structure or the entire system. So while a white person's feelings may get hurt, which is not a good thing, you're not in danger for your life. You're not in danger when you visit a hospital, or you're sitting in a classroom, right? Or you're just purchasing candy, okay? So that's the big difference. Black people cannot be racist because racism requires a type of power that Black people are denied. I want to also share with you that I have several slides with all the sources that I've used and some references and some suggested readings, but I'll have to share that later somehow, or you can have it in the video. And I think I'll end here. Thank you again to Dr. Abedinifat, Sophie Gardner, Darius Darcy, Connie Wu, An Lu, and also Razman. Thank you so much. A special shout out to one of my former students and forever comrade, Kelsey Martin, who is Chamorro. She is a community learning specialist at Whitman College, and she helped me with various student advice and care in shaping a meaningful land acknowledgement. And I welcome you to be in touch with me if there's anything you'd like to discuss that I've presented today. It's a lot to process. And even if you're an experienced anti-racist and someone who dedicates a lot of time and energy to the movement for Black lives, there's probably something I've said today that's controversial, provocative, and I'd love to hear from you and have some thought partnership on those points. At this point, I think, Sophie, Mustafa, I can turn it over to you if we're ready for questions, possibly.
Hi. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Amy, for your very thought-provoking, as you mentioned, talk. I think we might have some questions And I believe that actually Connie or Sophie is taking the questions. And if not, of course, I will have some questions for you. Yes, we do have actually some questions. I think I need to, okay, just a moment. I need, okay, questions.
I see one.
Sure.
Should I take it, Mustafa? Okay, so question a question from Benjamin. Yes. What is the current Iranian government's position, if any, on Black members of society? That's a great question, Benjamin. And I'm going to be honest and say I'm not entirely an expert on present day Iran, but I can share with you some interesting facts about how the Iranian government has shown up for Black people. So one of the interesting anecdotes for me as someone who studies racism is when the Iranians took hostages from the American embassy in 1979, 1980, they released the women and the Black people. I think there was a Black man among them first. And one of the reasons was because they said, in your country, you are the people who are treated the worst and you're free to go. And that has been the attitude of this particular Islamic Republic, where, as you see with the George Floyd murder, they're quick to show solidarity to Black communities in the world. But when it comes to Black Iranians, you'll want to know that Black Iranians, even after the abolition of enslavement, remained in Southwest Iran and sort of are very much locked into their own communities. And that's something that I'd like to investigate myself more. And I'm looking to a lot of the scholars that I named whose work directly addresses some of these issues that you asked. So I recommend you turn to those scholars who are doing incredibly important work. Thank you for your question. More? Do we have anybody?
Yes, I think we have another question, Amy.
Yes, great. Okay, Ross, thank you. Yes, can we hear a bit more about the statistics and specifics of Black slaves in Iran in the 1800s? Ross, fantastic. I think numbers and statistics and what was happening with Black African enslaved people is very, very important. In the 1800s, we're talking about the Qajar dynasty, right? Very wealthy class, very eager to imitate Europeans in particular. And so but this is where the Iranian apologists emerge, right? And they'll say things like, well, but the Black enslaved people that they had were treated like family. And as I said, I mean, I don't know how many of you castrate your family members and then force them to stand watch over your women and children, right? A lot of these kinds of the Black women who were part of the harems, the nannies and home caretakers and so on, who were not compensated for their labor, right, makes this a classic case of enslavement. The numbers I'm learning far exceed 3 million, as far as transport from the eastern coast of Africa into different parts of the Indian Oceanic world. And a good number of that 3 million, I think roughly 500,000, were specifically transported into the Iran, Iraq, that Gulf area, the Persian Gulf area. So I hope that gives you somewhat of an answer, but I'd also have to look a little bit more into those specifics. But thank you for your question. Hamid, okay, was anti-Blackness part of the social dogma in old Persian Empire, or is it mostly a Western phenomenon? Yeah, Hamid, awesome question, thank you, because I've been looking into this too, to understand, not just in the Iranian context, but more broadly throughout the world. Did peoples have a notion of race before the clear definitions that develop out of Enlightenment Europe? My short answer to you is no. Anti-Blackness is specifically something that relates to the system of race as a system of power. But as you may know, colorism is something that has been a part of world cultures for generations, right, for millennia. And that may have contributed to some forms of racism that emerge with the European Enlightenment. So yeah, anti-Blackness, as far as I know, and I'm not an expert on ancient Persian culture, is not something that was part of the practices of the ruling powers, right? Of course, people were enslaved. Enslavement as an institution has a long and varied history. But what's interesting for me, because we're still living in the consequences of it, is what happens with racialized enslavement, more specifically chattel enslavement. And the Iranians started to participate more and more in that as they built more relationships with the Europeans in the 1800s. And I mean, I hope you're as shocked as I am that Iran finally abolished enslavement in 1929. So thank you, Hamid. I hope that answers some of your question. Thanks. Question from Shireen. Can you tell us more about how to address cultural appropriation, such as Haji Firuz? Oh, Shireen, thank you so much. This is such a great question. Yeah, so for a lot of you, I would highly recommend that you follow some of these grassroots organizers that are on social media. Here in Los Angeles, we have an amazing organization of activists with different backgrounds from Southwest Asia. I'd also like to point out, I don't say Middle East because it is a colonial imperial term that was placed upon the territories of our ancestors, and I reject it. So Southwest is a more appropriate term, sits better on my heart. I don't know about you all, but so yeah, this organization, Southwest Asian and North African Los Angeles, actively goes out to predominantly Iranian and Persian communities during Nowruz and educates the community. If people are selling the relics of Haji Firuz or have any kind of representation of Haji Firuz, they take their time, they explain, they talk about anti-Blackness, they really put in that important work of educating why it's not appropriate. And I know Haji Firuz has a lot of interesting stories about who he is and how he emerges, including he went to hell or he was some kind of a chimney sweeper, right? I don't know, I don't buy it. We're living in a post-1492 world. It's anti-Black. It's Iranians, non-Black Iranians wearing blackface. So to me, Shirin John, exit out, right? There's no need for it. Just like some of us place the goldfish on the half scene and some of us don't, right? Horrible comparison. My point is exit out. In my home, in my parents' home, we don't do Haji Firuz. And most of my comrades in the LA area don't do Haji Firuz. We need to just put it in the terrible dredges of Iranian history and anti-Blackness. So thank you for your question. Hope that helped. Atta, thanks a lot. Oh, the pleasure is mine. I wanted to ask about ways in which Islamic science and medicine have shaped both the slave trade and the oh my goodness, Atta. Okay. So again, this is part of the work I'm uncovering, because I want to say that in Islam, it's a sin to enslave a Muslim. Okay, so just like the Christians, I hope you all know this history, the Catholic Church also said that enslavement was okay, right? Enslavement was okay. So Catholicism and Islam, enslavement is fine, but don't enslave one of our own, right? And this was part of the appeal to enslave Black Africans who were not monotheistic. Okay. And that's something I want to unpack more because it gets complicated. You do have Black Africans who identify as Arab because they are Muslim. And so I wonder if this was a response to Islamic enslavement, that you shouldn't, even though I'm being racialized as Black, you shouldn't enslave me because I'm a Muslim, right? So yeah, that's a fantastic question. And those intersections are super important when we think about Southwest Asia and our interactions with Africa in particular. Thank you, I'm happy you're here. Neda, okay, thanks Neda. Why does the United States continue to categorize MENA peoples as white? Right, Neda, what? So yes, and there, I highly recommend Dr. Maglube's book, The Limits of Whiteness. It's a fantastic exploration of this very same question, Neda. And from my personal experience and my professional research, it's basically to strengthen the category of white. If you think about it, there are more non-white per the racial categorization of Europeans, okay? The system of race. There are more Black and brown people on this planet than there are white people. So that can be a threat to them, yes? And this is why in the various stages of racial citizenship in the United States, you have people who were first deemed not white, like the Irish, and they're not Black, that's a whole other thing, but they were deemed non-white. And then the northwestern European peoples here decided that we need more of us, so okay, we'll make the Irish white, right? And then the Italians can be white, the Polish, let's let them in. And eventually, there's famous cases in the 1950s in the United States where you have people of Southwest Asian ancestry who were suing the government to claim that they are white too. Our own people, Neda, were fighting in the courts to hold a place of being white because they knew it meant advantage, right? So yeah, this struggle is real. Again, like how can we be white and yet people of color? That just is, it's so hard to get, right? There's a definite dissonance for us, our lived experiences versus what we're claimed as on paper. So yeah, Nada, let's struggle. Let's be part of that struggle to change it. Thank you. Ross, okay. Were there also non-Black slaves in pre-19th century Iran? Were there Iranian slaves? Absolutely, Ross. Yes, yes. And this is why it's so interesting to think about how the practice of enslavement in Iran changes from enslaving people who are Circassian and Georgian and Iranian into this racialized form of enslavement that follows the models of the Europeans, right? So I think here's a good point to pause for a second and say something. I don't know how many of you say this. You don't have to admit it to me. But I know Iranians who say this a lot. They'll make the claim that their ancestors, or they have, you know, a connection, a familial connection to the Qajars or to the Pahlavis. Okay. Do they also think they are responsible for reparations to the Black Iranian community, right? So that was a little bit of a tangent, but I want to throw it out there as we keep processing and thinking about how Iranians are complicit in a post-1492 anti-Black world. But yes, Ross, absolutely, there were non-Black slaves. They were treated differently. I will also add that. They were allowed to have their own families and homes, and they could actually work their way out of enslavement, versus the Black Africans who are enslaved are often castrated, they are denied kinship. A lot of similarities to the ways that the transatlantic slave trade was working on the Atlantic side, right? So excellent question, thank you. Bahad. What steps and action can we take in the academic world and institutions? Solid. Thank you so much, Sister Comrade. Yes. So I think there's a lot, Bahar, and the main thing to remember is that non-Black people should never lead these actions, okay? But I guarantee you, wherever it is you are, you have Black freedom fighters who are and have been addressing these same questions. So one of your first steps, if you haven't done this already, is find your comrades, find your people. Who are the Black folks at your institution, in your city, who are doing the work of freedom and liberation, which we all will benefit from, right? It's, you know, let me say this again, as I open with W.E.B. Du Bois, these systems were not meant to support Black life. So academia and the institutions of academia are anti-Black. I want you all to, for example, I'm a United States thinker on these issues, so I reference the United States, but if you're in Canada, maybe examine that. But yeah, I think it's important for you to see how many of these institutions were built by enslaved Black people, right? Not only upon indigenous lands, but who actually constructed these buildings. And here in the United States, we do have some movement work happening where there is a form of reparations where the descendants of those people, those Black enslaved people who built the institutions, their descendants can attend those universities now on scholarship, right? Doesn't mean the institution's not anti-Black, right? But it's a step, it's a type of apology and action. So again, I would highly recommend you look to the Black freedom fighters at your institutions, in your cities. These folks have been doing the work for 400 plus years. Something I heard today from a Black scholar that has been sitting with me is, just because it's new to you doesn't mean it's new, right, everybody? Just because it's new to us doesn't mean it's new, but welcome. You are always welcome to join. As Malcolm X said, the good thing is to see how everyone is doing the work in their own communities. This is why I'm with you today, right? As a diasporic Iranian, I love my people. I know we can do better. And so I'm here, but in solidarity with Malcolm X, who did the work with his community, right? And white folks with white folks, and East Asian folks with East Asian folks, and so on. There's a lot of work. Anti-Blackness is everywhere. That was a long-winded question. I loved it though, Bahar. Thank you. Pantea, I love that name. Okay, how does anti-Blackness fit into the ethnic tensions between Arabs and Persians, Iranians in the, you mean Southwest Asia, right, Pantea? Both historical and contemporary. Oh, yes. So, wow, that's a deep question, Pantea. Awesome. More power to you. It's good thought partnership. You're processing. You better email me. We need to talk some more. Yes, so I think one of the things we can think about is a lot of Persians, a lot of Iranians, some of my own very close family members included, feel the relationship between Persians and Arabs is one of colonization. Okay. It's not lost on me that it took 453 years for all of Iran to convert to Islam, whether the conversion was voluntary or not. And so those tensions, we have to acknowledge and understand and put into a context sort of boxed off with itself. But I will say, and this is, you know, something that my Arab comrades are doing a lot of work on and around, it was Arab Muslim traders who introduced Black Africans as enslaved peoples to Europeans, and then consequently to Persians and Iranians. It is the Portuguese, actually, who use the Persian Gulf as a port and have on their ships Black Africans. I'll also just throw out there that not all Black Africans who are in Iran were enslaved. Okay, so it depends on some of the travel and the interactions and so on. But definitely those tensions inform each other. I will say that, Pantea, John. Very good question. Please email me. Let's talk more. Oh, okay. So our last question for today. Are there Persian language resources that can be shared with friends and family in Iran? Any suggestions on books, papers to read to further read on this topic? I wish I knew your name, friend. I'm sorry that I can't address you by name. Yes, absolutely. One of my mentors is Frantz Fanon, F-A-N-O-N, Fanon. Frantz Fanon wrote a very important book, which becomes a revolutionary manifesto. And it was Ali Shariati who translated that book into Persian. So, dear question asker, I would highly recommend that you share that text with your family and friends in Iran, The Wretched of the Earth. I wish my own Persian was stronger and I could read Shariati's translation. I've tried and it takes me a really long time, but it's on my list of things to do. But yes, so please start there. And I'm really happy to say that many of our scholars in diaspora also can, including Dr. Abedini Fard, they can write just as effectively in Persian and English and other languages. So I can share some of those resources with you through email if you will be in touch with me. Thank you. Wow, your questions made me so happy, so happy. I'm so honored to have shared this space with you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Please be in touch. There's a lot of work we can do.
Thank you very much. Again, Amy John. Well, this is amazing. This is amazing. It generated a lot of really thought-provoking, questions. While we're on the resources topic, right? Not in Persian. I was just thinking what we could actually introduce in Persian. At least I can't remember anything now. Right. But in terms of English resources, because unfortunately there are not too many either, with a specific attention to the Iranian context, but at least two comes to my mind. I mean, in addition to what you mentioned, one is, and I'm definitely sure that, I think you mentioned Dr. Behnaz Mirzai, right?
Okay, so Mustafa, sorry to interrupt you, and with all due respect to Dr. Mirzai, whose work is super important, and actually look what's right on my desk, everybody. Hello, it's her book, right? She's an apologist, man. She's an apologist. So I don't recommend that folks start here. Okay, please don't start here. But there are, and if I can, Mustafa John, Sophie, if I can email you a list of texts that maybe you can share out later. There's a lot actually, and a lot of it is, I mentioned some of the scholars, right? Bita Bagulizadeh, Neda Maghloubesh, Shadi Malaklu, Parisa Vaziri. They're doing some really amazing stuff.
And Reza Zia Ibrahimi, Reza Zia Ibrahimi, right? The Emergence of Iranian Nationalism, Race and the Politics of Dislocation.
Yes. Okay. Yes.
Yeah. But no, thank you. I really appreciate that. I would like to again thank everyone for being here today, joining us. And I would also like to say that Amy, as you mentioned, is happy to be contacted by email as per her final slide. Also, we would love to hear attendee feedback about both this session and future sessions via our 5-minute survey. I think Sophie will kindly post that link in the chat box for everyone to see. And last but not least, I would like to invite all of you to join us in our next session of the series, which will be held on October 17th. So please mark your calendar if you haven't done so already. We will be having Dr. Amir Hossein Wafa from Shiraz University in Iran. And he's an assistant professor in English and comparative literature at Shiraz University. His talk is titled No Heaven for Gungadin, which is a novel written in 1965 by an Iranian in English, actually. So the title is No Heaven for Gungadin, From Speculative Fiction to Decolonial Option. This, among all of our talks, this one only will be held at 11 a.m. PD time or PS time. Otherwise, all of our talks, just like the one for Dr. Tahani-Bidmeshki today, are going to be held at 4 p.m. on Saturdays. Thank you so much again for being with us. And thanks, Amy John.
The honor is mine. Thank you.
Thank you.
More power to everybody.
Have a great day. Thanks.
You too. Take care.